Hello, I'm Debbie Evans. Welcome to another UK column interview. Now, this is part two of a very special interview that, if you haven't seen part one, please go and look at part one because we're going to be meeting again John Beaudoin today. Irrefutable evidence. What do you do when you get 1.5 million unredacted death certificates through your door? Well, that's what happened to John. And in part one, we were talking about how that happened, why that happened, and the results of what he found out. And today we're going to be talking a bit about John's life before COVID. And I'm going to be joined by my great friend, Cheryl Grainger, who is an independent pharmaceutical consultant trainer. And we're going to be not just exploring a bit about John's life, but also about what's going forward and some of the data that he's uncovered. What can we do in the UK as a result of his findings in the USA? So let me start by first introducing John Beaudoin. Thank you so much. You're connecting via Massachusetts to the UK. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us yet again, because part one, quite frankly, was fascinating. Welcome.
And it's always, a pleasure to talk to you guys. It's been, the last time was good. So I'm looking forward to this.
Well, we've got tons of questions, hence part two, because it was fascinating. And of course, joining me, Cheryl, thank you so much for giving your time again. And I know you're as excited as I am. So welcome back to another UK column interview.
Thanks, Debbie. Hello, John. This should be just as fascinating, hopefully. I mean, just to remind you, last time we talked about obtaining the death certificates, or 1.4 million of them, and the errors and omissions and the false coding of all that data that the authorities had brought to us. And then talk went around seasonality of the results and the age influence on the results of the reactions to the vaccinations, and then the symptoms, the actual adverse reactions, clear in John's analysis. And obviously the differences then between 2020 and 21, when the vaccines were then rolled out at the beginning of 21. And we also talked about some treatments, which we might go on and talk about some more. But I'd like to go back to the beginning. And obviously, John was in Massachusetts, which is quite handy because that's where the death certificates first came from. And I think it would be interesting to hear a little bit more about your career prior to changing it to be a data analyst. And if you'd fill us in on your background and what makes you perfect for having this information come over your desk.
Well, there's a lot there. I'll say a few things I haven't really said to the world yet. The 150 podcasts or whatever I've done. I feel guilty in my career. It was easy for me. I worked sometimes 15 or 20 hours a week. That's all I needed to do. I was bored with everything else, and there's a lot of dinners. I won trips through the projects and contracts that I worked on. So there were large contracts for semiconductor research and development. Before that, it was a lot of board design and chip design. I didn't do the designs. I got to talk to engineers about their designs. So I would go visit a company and say, "What are you doing?" And they would tell me, and I'd say, "Oh, well, if you change your architecture a little bit, you could use this chip and save board space, power, time, and deliver some type of value. If you deliver value to them, they're willing to pay you a portion of that value." That's really what sales should be about, instead of trying to jam a product down somebody's throat. So, yeah, I was well trained. They put like $40,000 of training into me for public speaking, presentation giving, strategic planning. That's where everything I do comes from, is strategic planning. And although, I would make fun of the training, I was kind of like the class clown in a lot of the trainings where I would not take it seriously. They thought I wasn't taking it seriously, but then I would use it and appreciate it. And it's just a strange career I had. I like I think you heard me say on another podcast, I would get a private tour of the Vatican with the group I was with because the company paid $1 million or so for that private tour, and say, oh, here's the Sistine Chapel, stay as long as you want. Most people get ushered in and ushered out in groups, all jammed together. And the Japanese contingent in our company pull out the cameras and start taking all their flash pictures, and all the signs say no flash pictures. They can't read English. So it was kind of funny. And we had up to, I think, 200 people that would go on these trips. So Monte Carlo, dinner in the Prince's Private Auto Museum. It's got some really cool cars going way back to the beginning of cars. And then all the Monte Carlo cars, as well as, the original Ford Model T and stuff like that. So private tour of the Vatican, the Monte Carlo trip, Istanbul was a good trip. The funny trip for me was New York City. All the guys from around the world were like, oh, we're going to New York City. And I'm like, oh, going to New York City. I have to jump on a train and take 2-hour trip down to New York City. At the Waldorf Astoria, it's like, yeah, it's a little hotel room in a big city. To me, New York City was nothing, right? It'd be like you guys going to London and saying, wow, we're going to London. It wasn't a big deal. But back to the important stuff, that's where I learned people. And that's what it comes down to, is understanding people, whether it's reading psychology books. And I think you mentioned Asch conformity tests. There's the Milgram experiments, and all that stuff we learned in school actually applies. It really works when you evaluate people. How can I manipulate? I say manipulate. It's not a very nice word. How can I get the guy on the other side of the table to sign the contract? What can I say to entice him? Either at the beginning of a 2 or 3 year program. And I plan things out for years. And what I'm doing with COVID data, it's a strategic multi-year plan.
I've been watching your podcasts, John, and I know that, the lifestyle and the companies that you worked for and the amount of money that you've managed is immense. And then all of a sudden, you've gone from that to literally holding yourself up in an office pretty much 24/7, 365, analysing all of this data. I mean, it's an extraordinary parallel universe that you're now living. And I just wanted our viewers and listeners to know really of the involvement that you had with these massive, great big companies with huge budgets. I mean, how does it feel now to looking at all of that from where you are now with what you found out?
It's really weird. I'm just a guy. I did a job. I was really good at it. Everybody in that business thinks they're the best in the business, but I really was. When I evaluate people, it's almost not nice to psychologically try to figure somebody out, right? But in a job where you multi-millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, without cost of goods sold, for your audience to understand, if I sell $250 million of computers, right? That's, if I were to sell software, it's like 20 million. Why? Because the computers have a cost associated with them. When you're selling software, intellectual property, design services, things like that, well, the services do have a cost because you have to pay your guys to do the design. But with software, when you're doing very large deals, since there's no cost of goods sold, it's all profit when you do the deal, when you're done at the end. And so it's equivalent to like $250 million deals that I was doing. And I'm nobody. I'm not rich. I don't have a lot of money. Really have nothing left anymore. But how did I do that and then end up here? It's kind of weird. One thing we used to say in the business is there's no point in doing something somebody else is very good at. Unless you believe you can win through fragmentation or flanking or strategies that are not frontal. If you're going to go frontal, you have to have an overwhelming advantage. Your product has to be 10 times better. It has to be much faster. It has to be much cheaper. If you don't have that frontal attack advantage, that overwhelming advantage, if you don't have the overwhelming advantage, you can't go frontal. You have to come in through, hey, we're already doing business over here. Why don't you give me this little other side contract? You try to fragment the company, right? The way I looked at this, the ideas, the marketplace of ideas with COVID is I just assumed everybody was lying, because when I saw Fauci, I knew immediately the guy was lying. It's just in my business, you just have to read people, and there are mechanics and electricians and hairdressers who can also discern somebody is lying to them. So it's nothing to do with there's training involved and there's being intelligent, but that social intelligence and being able to interact with somebody and read them, it's almost not trainable. Some of it is you can teach somebody little cues to look for, but they'll make mistakes. Like I have a skin allergy, so I touch my face a lot. And they say, "Oh, you're lying because you touched your face." That's not always the case. Like I got an MBA late in life, 51 through 54 years old. And in one of the first classes, the professor said, is talking to the class, it was organizational behavior. Well, you see, I can tell, like John here in the front row, he has no respect for me because he's leaning to one side and he's not paying attention. And she said a bunch of stuff about me. She didn't like me, obviously, to the class full of much younger people. And then she asked me a question. I said, well, I got in a mountain biking accident 3 days ago. And you see, I rolled up my sleeve. It has all these bloody scratches on my arm. I said, I also have a titanium plate in my neck with 3 vertebrae fused. And when I went over the handlebars of the bike 3 days ago, I not only fractured 2 vertebrae in my back, I also herniated the disc C4, C5, which is above the C5, 6, 7 fusion. And so I'm leaning to one side because I'm not taking painkillers so I can pay attention in class, and I'm in a lot of pain. It's got nothing to do with an attitude toward you. And she looked like an idiot in front of the class. So her assessment of me is I learned in a textbook when somebody has this body language, then they must be this, right? But she was completely wrong, and she doesn't have the ability to discern between an actual physical ailment and I really wasn't paying attention. I was paying attention. I was taking notes. So that ability to go beyond the textbooks and in the moment read somebody, I picked up right away with Fauci. And I thought, wow, they're going to kill a lot of people. As soon as they started all the social lockdowns and everything else, my immediate concern was husbands and wives that could be together for 40, 50, 60 years, all of a sudden are going to have a problem. Why? Well, they're locked in a house for 24 hours a day. That's never happened before. The guy has gone to work. He's out of the house for 10 hours a day. And they can do that for 10, 20, 30 years. But they can't do that for 2 weeks if it's 24 hours a day in a house. And if you go a little bit younger, right, with parents with younger kids, you have abuses of the children, both sexually and physical abuse, where you're changing the social dynamics down to the very house level, right? This all went through my head within minutes. I said, you're going to create negative externalities of pathologies in people where you're going to you're going to have people beaten and sometimes killed. You're going to have drug addicts return to doing drugs. And I was right about, won't get into George Floyd. I did a whole show on him. That was about being locked down. He was getting clean. And he went back and did drugs because he was told, oh, by the way, your 2 jobs, you're fired from both of them. Stay in your house surrounded by these in the low income housing that you're in. Stay there and be surrounded by drug dealers trying to stay clean from drugs. Like, of course, he did fentanyl. And then we all went through the BLM stuff. All that stuff went through my head immediately. And it's all played out exactly as I thought it would. But to understand the various aspects of externalities, and I use that word because it's an economics term. There's psychological, sociological, moral, philosophical, and then you get the biology. The biology and the physician, doctor, you guys call them GPs over there. That's a tiny little piece of all this. The CARES Act is a behavior modification. When you look at what they've done, it's exactly what I would do in my career, putting a strategic plan together. And I'm going on past the what happened in my career, but that's what I did in my career. And that's why I only work 10 to 15 hours a week, because I would look at something and figure it out and then come up with a plan. I was working probably 16 hours a day for 2 months in compression time down to the end of the contract, making sure all my engineers were talking to their engineers and messaging, saying the same thing over and over as part of the plan. But in the 2.5 to 3 years it takes to develop the whole plan and contract, I wasn't working 10 to 15 hours a week, but then all the stress and compression, it sounds great. Oh, you make a lot of money, you do a contract. But it's almost like psychological torture. I'm in the shower thinking about what I'm going to say to a guy and how I'm going to change his mind or manipulate him toward a contract term that's adverse to our position. And how do I get him to change that contract term? What am I going to trade him in return to get him to yield on that so that we can get something else? And what's a win-win for both sides? I'm in the shower, I'm sleeping, I'm dreaming about it. I mean, it's a lot of stress for a couple of months as you come down to the end of that contract negotiation and negotiations planning. So it's really hard. It's really stressful. It's the kind of thing that creates heart attacks. But then for the next 2 years, it's not working hard, just making sure everybody on the team is doing their thing around the world in various engineering organizations. So, that's my career. And because I have a very strange career of understanding the various purviews of, morality, psychology, sociology, economics, finance, accounting, I can just see the CARES Act for what it is as a behavior modification device. I can see the PrEP Act. I went to law school. That kind of rounded me out quite a bit 3 years ago. I went for a year before they kicked me out for not getting the vaccine. And that kind of, I've been academically lazy my whole life because I can get away with not working hard and using my brain. I made a decent amount of money by doing so. And I put all my time into raising my sons. I coached 50 teams of what you guys call football. In America, we call it soccer. 50 teams, 1,000 games, 500 games, 1,000 trainings or practices. A lot of time put in. And that's because family meant more to me than anything. And I had a difficult situation being a single father of 3 young boys. And, it really helped to not have to work hard and to use my brain to make a decent amount of money so I could spend more time with my sons and coaching them because it was important to me. That's how I came to be in this position. And when COVID hit, I looked at what was happening and I did something that they can't mess with all-cause deaths. Everything else, they're lying about cases. People were following cases. I'm like, why are people following cases? They're lying about all of them. What's the point in even looking at the data? You won't find me talking about cases in the last 4.5 years. It's a waste of time because all the cases were predicated on that PCR BS, right? You guys know what BS is over there, right? Okay. So I never looked at cases. The only thing they couldn't mess with is all-cause death. And what I said back then, I said it out loud, is the only way they can mess with all-cause death is to actually murder people. And there's no way they're doing that. That's how I felt. That's what I said. There's no way they're doing that. And I was wrong. But in the context of that time, I noticed that some bigger name guys were picking up all-cause mortality. And I thought, well, if they're doing it, why should I do it? Because they're smarter. They have PhDs. So I'm done with all-cause. And I moved on to the law school. And then I started looking at when the vaccine came out in early 21. I thought, okay, let's compare COVID death rates in places where the vaccine is and look at vaccine uptake rates. And I looked at Trinidad and Tobago. They didn't have any COVID deaths for a year. And then they started vaccinating. And 2 weeks after they started vaccinating, they started getting COVID deaths. And Vietnam, Vietnam, but I think it was Taiwan I looked at. And then I looked at, I threw in an Eastern European country just to make sure I had somewhat of a seasonal northern climate because Trinidad and Tobago is in the Caribbean and Taiwan's pretty hot and same temperature all year round pretty much. So I always looked at seasons. I figured out seasonality way back. And I looked at the one confusing place was Bolivia. and I couldn't figure out Bolivia. It did not fit my model. And it was driving me crazy until I looked at a satellite photo of Bolivia and I saw a bunch of brown. I'm like, I thought it was like South American jungle-y. And I looked, I'm like, oh, the most populous city is 10,000 feet, 10,000 feet high. It doesn't get hot there. It's cool. So it didn't fit the model. I had the wrong seasonality. And then I looked at the second most populous city. It's in the jungle. And I started looking at city by city. I'm like, oh, it does fit the model. The seasonality and temperature variations do work. Deaths rise when you get to cooler temperatures, obviously. And so I looked at things that were different from most people. And when the bigger names started looking at something, I walked away from it. But then when I got the database, I tried to give it to PhDs. They did some analyses. Nothing. The only guy that did, so Joel Smalley in the UK did a really good job with the first article with regard to all cause and the database. But then having given it to professors at universities, like 3 of them, nothing came of it. So like, I guess I got to do it myself. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized that I'm doing things that nobody else has done. And why doesn't epidemiology look at the most obvious data signals? And that's kind of how I got into all this. So that's a long-winded version.
Thank you so much for that, John. I think I'm going to come on later in the interview to talk to you about something that you've just said you're very passionate about, which is family and youngsters. And I think that everybody watching will completely identify with that. And what I'm going to say is there's going to be a very important message for youngsters during this video, during this interview. So please stay with us. But for now, I'm going to throw back to our good friend Cheryl, because she wants to ask you, John, about Massachusetts and why was the Massachusetts data so important? So Cheryl, over to you.
Yeah, John, I can understand completely what you're saying with Fauci and what have you, because every night we had 3 stooges talk to us about figures, and they constantly told how many people had died. Didn't tell them that that's of COVID. They didn't tell anybody any data about how many people normally died in a normal day. It was all taken out of context. And to me, the whole thing was illogical and unscientific. I didn't understand it at all. And of course, the National Health Service became the National COVID Service, because you weren't allowed to go there unless you were stopping breathing and suffering from COVID, that a PCR or other had told you got. So I can completely understand what you've just been saying. So I want to take you back to Massachusetts and why the Massachusetts data was so important. And I can put a slide up of some information that I've pinched from some of your chats. And basically, this is talking about the number of people, I presume with COVID in 2020, or death. But it also links into all the other things around the Massachusetts area that makes it an ideal test place for the launch of all this.
Yeah, thank you. I've given this part so many times, I'll whip through it pretty quickly. The issue of why Massachusetts is so important. It's not just that I live here. Massachusetts has about 600 pharma companies in the ecosystem of pharma. They sell to pharma like materials to produce things. $47 billion in venture capital financing is behind new pharma companies that start in Massachusetts. There are 50 companies over $100 million a year in revenue in pharma in Massachusetts, and 10 companies over $1 billion a year in revenue in pharma in Massachusetts. Moderna's headquarters in R&D is in Massachusetts. Pfizer's divisional headquarters for their mRNA injection is in Massachusetts. The CDC director during COVID was Rochelle Walensky. She's one of them, after Robert Redfield. And she's from Massachusetts. My congressman is Jake Auchincloss. His father was Fauci's number 2 for many years, Hugh Auchincloss. So Massachusetts is central to all of this pharma stuff. They are the number 1 state in the entire United States for NIH, National Institutes of Health funding from the federal government. And it's kind of interesting that if you were to look at that slide I had up that said July 27, 2020, that's a snapshot in time where I tracked for the first year and a half, less than a year and a half. I think it was up until June 2021 that I tracked every month on the 27th of every month. What are the purported number of COVID deaths for every sovereign? And a sovereign, in my case, I define it as any nation or United States state that has 3 million or more people. So if a state had 3 million or more people, it would be on the list, and any nation that had 3 million or more people. And in the entire world, the sovereigns with the highest purported COVID deaths per population were New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts. So much that they ran away from the world in claiming that there were so many COVID deaths that Belgium was a distant fourth. In fact, Massachusetts was 50% more than Belgium. And a lot of people say Belgium is the most corrupt country in Europe. And I don't know, I'm not from there, but I'll believe and it's, of course, there's no way to measure it. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on in Belgium from the whole EU perspective. And I would say, yeah, where you get power, you get corruption. And so if Belgium's the number one there and Massachusetts is 50% more, and then you look at the context of the situation again, where a virus starts halfway around the world in China, but the three places, New York, New Jersey, and Massachusetts, with the most to gain, reported the most deaths. What a coincidence. So yeah, having the Massachusetts data is not just because I live here. It's because it is the center of all this pharma stuff.
That's explained brilliantly. I'd like to put the next slide up if I can, Stephanie, which would allow just to summarise all these main points, some stunning points that we made in part one.
My picture is blocking out the first two. So it said they weren't given antibiotics. Yeah. How did they drive the numbers up? And why do I say it was basically murder? It wasn't. The all-cause increases actually were murder. Here I am 3 years later refuting myself from 2020, where I thought they would never do that. The individuals who did it didn't know they were doing it. It was a consequence of the behavior modification of the policies and laws that were put in place. And the people who did it centrally, like at the NIH, who came up with the COVID treatment protocols, the COVID treatment recommendations. And you can Google that right now. NIH space COVID-19 space treatment space recommendations. That'll come up with a page if you do a search for that. And in that page, it'll still say remdesivir now. And it did on April 21st, 2020. They came up with a protocol and they haven't changed it 4.5 years, as if they haven't learned anything. And in that protocol, they put in ventilators and stuff like that. And they knew within months, doctors knew within months that ventilators were killing people. But they did it anyway. So they caused bacterial infections. They said, oh, there's no point in giving antibiotics for a virus. You'll create antibiotic resistance in the patient. Well, if somebody's dead, then they're not very well antibiotic resistant, are they? Or are they? Does it matter? No, it doesn't matter. You killed them because you withheld the life-saving antibiotics that they needed at the time. And that did happen. So they drove through many avenues. It was antibiotics through coercion from the American Board of Internal Medicine, Family Medicine, pediatrics, the Federation of State Medical Boards, the state licensing boards, the protocols from the NIH, FDA, CDC. Those all combined in various ways to modify the behaviors of the doctors who thought they were prescribing what was going to save the patient because the NIH said it would. And they've all become robots that just follow what the NIH says to do. Let's see. Hospital protocol murders. Somebody at the top knew what they were doing. Like I said, if you get central authority, then they can get people downstream to do a lot of crazy stuff and not even know that they're killing people. More than 500,000 people died from the COVID vaccine, but another 500,000, and this is the United States numbers I'm talking about, died another 500,000 from the hospital protocols. Recently, I'm just going to instead of reviewing this right here, I'm going to say something brand new, which is, and we're going to come out with a press release next week. I went down to Connecticut because I now have their records. And I have Minnesota too, so I have 3 states now, 3 major states. Vermont is very small, but we have that. So we have 4 states. Aaron Hertzberg in New York got that. So Connecticut, I went down and I handed them the Attorney General's office, the Governor's office, and the Public Health Commissioner's office. I handed them a brief, and in that brief, it's 22 pages, but it's double-spaced. It's not, a lot of it's just kind of fluffy stuff I have to write. But when it comes to the graphs, acute renal failure alone, if you look at acute renal failure, excess deaths in the context of history, it's the worst thing in 100 years. You say, how can that be? Nobody's talking about it. Nobody knows about it. It's like, no, it really is. 155,000 excess acute renal failure involved deaths in the last 4 years. And it's not COVID, because it didn't happen in the first wave. This is really important. I would like to know, and I have somebody looking into it, did it happen in Europe? Did N17 acute renal failure go up in Europe? If you have different things happening in terms of the human body from the same disease, well, it can't very well be the disease. It's the treatment. They killed 500,000 people here, 155,000 of which died with acute renal failure on their death records. To put that in perspective, it's more than polio and smallpox and everything that's happened in the last 100 years. Because the Spanish flu was 104, 5, 6 years ago, 106 years ago. So in the last 100 years, there's nothing else that comes close to the thing that they're not even looking at it, where they have a legal duty to look at that. And that's the message I delivered to the officials in Connecticut last week. There's more coming. There's more on the vaccine. There's more on cancers. As I roll out these studies all summer long about Connecticut, I'm going to wrap in Massachusetts and Minnesota, and the world will see what people are dying from. The system I put together is better than any public health analysis system that we've seen from any of the governments in the United States. And I use the plural word because every state has its own government and is sovereign. So every state public health department and every federal agency like FDA, CDC, and NIH, they have like 250,000 people in all those agencies. And one guy in a basement with a computer who has an engineering degree put together a better early warning system and historical investigational tool to look at what is killing people, who is dying, when are they dying, the whole thing that I wrote in my book about seasonality profile, age spectrum profile, cause or symptom spectrum profile. So that's what I did last week, went down to Connecticut, and now it begins the analysis of Connecticut. Next week, you'll see more work. Ed Dowd is also coming out with something the exact same time next week, and that is with regard to acute renal failure as well. They came up with a number of 153,000 excess. I came up with 155,000. So you have 2 different groups, 2 different methodologies, using 2 different databases, came up with roughly the same number. It's real, and it goes down to 25 years old. Not 81-year-old COVID deaths up to 98-year-old COVID deaths. This is real. They're really killing people, and they die in the hospital. And, if it's not the protocols, it's not remdesivir, if it's not the vaccine, if they say everything they're doing is right, then what is it? Why are they avoiding study of the most prolific killer in the last 100 years in the United States? Why won't they do their jobs to investigate? Because how easy is it to investigate? It would take 1 man week for an astute person to look through certain records. You find anybody 25 to 44, there's about, say there's 100 or 200 of them. You can look through the medical files and do searches. What were their vital signs after they got remdesivir? And you have them hourly in the hospital. What were their blood labs? And you've got them like once or twice a day. And from the blood labs and imaging and vital signs and the times at which they were administered medications, and looking at the liver enzymes and looking at the creatinine levels, you can figure out what caused their kidneys to fail that killed them. It's that easy. But these 250,000 people who work for governments across the United States, None of them are looking at this. Nobody's talking about this. It's the biggest killer in 100 years. And if people say, oh, COVID, say no. Acute renal failure is bigger if you look at the life years lost. Because life years lost, you have to multiply by the number of years that they otherwise would have lived. And when compared to COVID, acute renal failure is worse. And it affects more people in society, being that if somebody 40 years old dies, right, with a 10-year-old, a 12-year-old, and a 16-year-old kid, then you're affecting those people too for the rest of their lives.
This is what seems to happen here with our MHRA. They're picking up on small signals that they might want to mention. And I know you said that only myocarditis is talked about as a limited hand gout play. It's the small things that they're looking at, not the major things. So we have had reports in our press about vaccine-induced thrombocytic thrombocytopenia, which had, I think, 445 cases reported, 81 deaths, which is about 20. But compared with, sudden death syndrome and what have you, there's a lot of death reports that are being ignored. They're not taking any of the major areas, like you've just said with your acute failure. They're not taking and looking at those things. They're just looking at something so that they can say there's some side effect, but it's not something to worry about. It comes to this point of making every side effect mentioned into extremely rare. And you presumably are telling us that's the same in the States.
Yes. When they talk about, if they can elevate the reach and voice of an individual who only talks about myocarditis, I say they being, say, whether it's military intelligence, the CIA, or a consortium of social media who conspire to send messages out to the people. But if they can get us all talking about one thing that's rare, instead of the thing that's killing people at 2 orders of magnitude greater, 100 times more deaths are occurring from X versus Y, and they're only talking about why, it allows them to say it's rare on the other side, right? Our opponents, our adversaries. That is what's happening. Now, you mentioned thrombocytopenia. Those numbers are very low. It's happening a hell of a lot more than that. But the question is, why is it happening? And people would say, well, it can't be causing all of these ailments. It can't be causing all of this stuff. Well, yeah, it can, because it's really only one thing. The blood is dysregulated. Blood and blood formation at the cellular level, where you have the 3 major cell types, like thrombocytes are platelets, right? Erythrocytes, red cells. And then in white cells, you have a whole bunch of different white cells, so many different white cells. And the dysregulation of the immune system has to do with that's blood formation, right? Along with the red cells and the platelets. Thrombocytopenia is a low platelet count, so you can't clot. Your intracranial hemorrhages are in the setting of thrombocytopenia. Your gastrointestinal hemorrhages are in the setting of thrombocytopenia. And when you add up all these hemorrhages around your body, be they a large one or like carpet bombing with a bunch of little ones, like leaky brain, early onset dementia due to leakage of capillaries in your brain. And I'll say, for Mark Girardeau, you should have him on to talk, because he has a lot of really good information of transfection T-cell attack, where it strips the endothelial lining of your inside lining of your blood vessels, and he can explain why a lot of things are happening. We don't agree that it's everything. He thinks it's everything has to do with that. And we can agree on 90% and disagree on 10%. But for what we agree on, I believe he's absolutely right. And it manifests in thrombocytopenia and other like clotting, like low platelet count is thrombocytopenia. Well, how is that happening in the same context of clotting? How can you have low platelet count and clotting? I'm not a biologist or a doctor, and I don't like to get into this, but there are certain white cells that, if dysregulated, macrophages, will, and what part of their job is to clean up old thrombocytes. Thrombocytes last like 10 to 12 days. If you start killing them at 1 to 2 days, then you're going to have a low platelet count instead of letting them live to do their job, right? So even though you're creating plenty of thrombocytes, plenty of platelets, and you have a low platelet count because they're all being eaten up and killed by these dysregulated macrophages who are going beyond their mission and killing good platelets instead of dying platelets. Just wanted to comment on thrombocytes.
Yeah, John, that was great. So what the other thing that people seem to fall back on a lot that gets reported by mainstream media is how many thousands of billions have been saved, whereas I believe it's the reverse of that. Have you got any idea what figure you put on to access due to treatment?
Yeah, those are impossible numbers to actually figure out. But, my opinion, having looked through all the data, is they haven't saved anybody. They killed a lot more people than they saved. And that manifests across the age strata. So let's look at Massachusetts. And Massachusetts is different, right? They killed a lot of people up front in the pandemic through the policies. And then later on, Minnesota caught on 9 months later and started enacting those policies and killing people. But in Massachusetts, the really old people were wiped out in 9 weeks, 8,800 people in mid-March to mid-June. And then nothing really happened with regard to COVID deaths over the summer, and they started up again in November. And when they started up in November, going into the new year, they started vaccinating. What happened was there was a shift where there was a deficit in the old people, the 85 plus. So the 85 pluses, the ones who would die, died. They're not around to die a second time. And so the rest that were left were super healthy. And so there was a deficit of deaths, fewer than normal, from February to June, July of 2021. Now that deficit canceled out the excess deaths that started in January for the 65 to 84 group. So 65, if you look at 65 plus, you have what's called a Simpson's paradox, where -1 and +1, you add them and it's 0. So there appears to be no signal. But if you separate them like I did, you find that the deficit in one cancels the excess in the other, where they say there is no excess. And they say, oh, we're saving people because the deaths are going down. It's like the deaths are down because of the deficit in the 85-year-olds. It should be down even more, though. If you were actually saving the people 65 to 84, and if you were actually saving the 85 plus people, then there should be a deficit in the aggregate, which there wasn't. It looked normal based on 2015 through 2019, but how do you account for the fact that a bunch of people are dead already and can't die twice? There should be a deficit less than normal. And when you look at all these signals and combine them, you realize there was excess death in 65 to 84 beginning in early 21 when they started vaccinating people. So it wasn't a lives saved, it was a lives taken. They were taking lives with those vaccines. There's no other way you can figure it out. The lockdowns were done. The society we weren't normal, but the bigger excess would have occurred from COVID in that age range. And then you start going down even younger. And you find that, let's take a look at pneumonia, COVID, and all cause. The graphs all look exactly the same, where you had the first wave that didn't really affect the younger people in the mid-March to mid-June. And then you start with your November second wave that went through February. Didn't really affect them either then. And then you go into the third wave another year later. And all of a sudden you have far more people dying of pneumonia after being vaccinated 2, sometimes 3 times. Some people had 3 shots by then in the third wave. How do you have far more people dying of pneumonia after getting their vaccines, having survived 2 full waves of COVID with the killer variants, if you believe in the variant talk, right? It makes absolutely no sense. So as far as lives saved, it didn't save anybody. Those vaccines saved nobody. There's no signal in the data. The curves were already going down when a lot of people were being vaccinated. If you go down through the age groups, they started with the really old people in January, February. They had the second shots by the end of February, sometimes March, in the nursing homes and stuff like that. And then you get into okay, now the 65 plus can get it. And that was like April, and then May was like maybe 45 plus. But there's a whole schedule where in age groups, they rolled it out from January to May. And it's like, oh, I can't wait to get my COVID shot. My age group is coming up. They're going to save me. It's like, no, they killed a bunch of people.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, one of the things that I've been talking about with the VAERS document analysis is the latest reports have been defining these vaccines as gene therapy. And does that make a difference in your mind to what's going to happen with the CARES Act?
Oh, the CARES Act. Well, the CARES Act is a rat's nest of calling other laws. So you get the PrEP Act, the CARES Act, and you have the CMS.gov and the NCTAP program and the payouts. It's really difficult to trace the accounting. Even the hospitals that are getting paid, they know where to submit their claim to get paid. They don't know all the law that it takes that enables that payment. But getting back to the law and the policies, the CARES Act, like I said, is a behavior modification. It was never intended to save anybody. Nothing in there has anything to save anybody or to give money to the states so that the states could save anybody. Everything in there is a modification of behavior of hospital administrators to kill people for money, to use ventilators, to prescribe remdesivir, to make sure that what was it, ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine are not used. So yeah, the laws that are put in place were never intended to save anybody. In fact, the CARES Act was written in 2018. 2018. They changed a few variables. It was finalized in 2019. And when COVID hit, they changed a few variables in March of 2020. So the intent was never to save a lot of people.
But the PrEP Act would be indemnifying the use of vaccines, wouldn't it? So we're talking here now about a genetic product, and therefore it doesn't come under the same banner. So can you see that would change it?
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because I forgot to address the most important part of your question. What is a vaccine? Yeah, it's they had to change the definition of vaccine. So legally now, from this point on, maybe they can call it a vaccine. You have to define something before you debate or argue about it. No, it was never a vaccine. It's gene drug therapy. I'm not a biologist, really not qualified to talk about it, except to say I'm a human being and I can discern, I can read, right? And very simply, it did not meet the definition of vaccine before COVID, period. Nobody can refute that. They had to change the definition in order to call it vaccine. Why? Because vaccine is an accepted word within society. People mostly associate vaccines with something good. People wouldn't take, try this new gene drug therapy that just came out that hasn't been tested. Nobody's going to sign up for that. But they'll sign up for, this is a new vaccine. Vaccine. Vaccines have been around for hundreds of years. I'll take a vaccine. So the wordplay is, again, they're marketing it to you, they're manipulating you with words. They also changed the word anti-vaxxer. People don't realize that. There actually was a definition. It used to be that it's anybody who's against all vaccines. They changed the definition to mean not only anybody who's against just one vaccine, but it's also anybody who's against any government edict, law, or mandate with regard to vaccines. So if you don't agree with the government in any way, you're now called an anti-vaxxer, whereas the old definition was you're against all vaccines. Very different definition. And then the use of the word anecdote. They relegated the most important evidence, which is case history, case studies, to be called anecdotal evidence. You even hear doctors programmed to call a case study anecdotal evidence. When I say they've relegated it to the trash heap, that is now the lowest form of evidence, where the highest form is a peer-reviewed, randomized controlled trial research paper from halfway around the world with a different water supply, genetics, and food supply than your patient standing in front of you. So you read the paper and you go, as a doctor, you do what the paper says instead of the patient right in front of you who might be completely different than the body of people that the paper was written about. It's crazy. So yeah, vaccines is different. The gene drug therapies are not vaccines. They've conned the world through wordplay and manipulation, and they've gotten the masses to accept something using a previously accepted word that really had nothing to do with the gene drug therapy they were trying to shove down your throats.
And actually, you brought me on to a subject that I wanted to discuss with you as well, because you're a gentleman with many hats, and the law is also, you were studying the law, right? Can you just, I have got a little video, because what I love so much about many of your channels, and we're going to ask you where we can find you in a minute. But before I do show the video, can I just ask you to give a little bit of background as to your involvement with the law? And was it true you got kicked off your course because you actually wouldn't take the injection?
Yeah. So in 2020, when I realized that a bunch of smarter people were doing the all cause, I actually had a sign from God. I talked about it in a few videos. It takes a little bit of time, so I won't get into it now. But basically, I had sued the governor over the mask mandate, and I didn't know what I was doing because I'm not a lawyer. I just copied a lawsuit somebody else did and changed a few laws and changed my reason for suing. And he changed the order for the entire state to get around my lawsuit. So I must have had an impact. But I went to law school on a whim in 2 weeks. They didn't require a standardized test to get in because it's not a very good law school. It's cheap. And I spent $28,000 that first year to go to that law school. And before I went a day to that law school, I wrote to the director of admissions. And I said, it says here I have to take the COVID vaccine when it's available. I'm not going to do that. I'm deaf in one ear. I'm deaf in one ear from a shot I got when I was 4 years old. I have zero hearing in my right ear since 4 years old. And I asked him, do you have an exemption process? And he wrote back to me three major things were in the email reply. Don't worry, you're over 30. You don't have to get vaccinated. Number two was, nobody from this school is going to ask you if you're vaccinated. And number three was, nobody from this school is going to be first in line for that vaccine. And so based upon that inducement, which, I mean, I knew certain things about contracts, having put together many contracts and done battle with lawyers to take terms out. And it's like you're overly constraining this contract such that neither party will sign it. And we would do battle with the legal representation from the corporations to try to get them to agree on the terms. They're all trying to protect the company, right? Each side. And I knew that you can't make side letters. You can't make promises outside the contract because that's very bad. It can be fraudulent inducement. And a lot of guys did that. I know guys that got fired. They got sacked from their jobs because they made a promise outside the contract, say, well, if you sign it, I'll give you this on the side. And then when they were caught giving the customer something on the side, that would be bad. But sometimes the customer said, you owe me this. You said you would do it. And the guy's like, well, yeah, I know, but the company won't let me do it. Well, then why did you promise you would do it? And so the law school made a promise to me. And it turns out it was a fraudulent inducement meant to get me to sign on the dotted line, pay the $28,000, and matriculate at their school, which I did. And then 9 months later, they say, you have to get a vaccine. I said, okay, I'll do an exemption. Where's your exemption thing? I filled out the religious exemption, which they held out to me. We have exemptions. Here's the religious exemption form. I did it. They never replied. I kept calling up saying, hey, when are you going to rule on this? The next year, law school year 2 is about to begin. And they just ignored me. And then I get a letter in the mail. You've been unenrolled. You have to pay your $28,000 loan. They just unenrolled me. And so I sued them, and the court said, oh, you don't have any standing. Because when the judge basically, when she found out it was about vaccines, she just ruled against me. I didn't get to a substantive argument or discussion. whether or not it was a contract violation, which it obviously is, which I obviously have standing. But she just did what she did because she wants everybody to get the vaccine. And she was clearly rude to my attorney. I had an attorney at that time representing me in an oral argument. So what do I know about the law? I only went to law school for a year. I learned civil procedure, and I got an A in contracts. I did really well in contracts. I did pretty good in torts. I don't know a lot of administrative law. I didn't do constitutional law. I didn't do evidence. I haven't taken the evidence class. But I know things. And it allowed me to understand law from an economic and moral perspective. And I have a different perspective on law than most lawyers in the United States. They're at the intersection of law and economics, and Chicago School of Law and Economics is really good at this. But they haven't put themselves out there because it's mostly a liberal place, and they don't want to go against the Democrat Party and all the COVID stuff going on. They stayed out of it. You know how universities are, schools are. But at the intersection of law and economics, they've dismissed many cases in the United States on standing doctrine. And that's I could probably teach a course on standing doctrine right now. Even lawyers say, "Oh, John, you don't understand standing," and then they try to explain it. They can't explain it. It's inexplicable. All it is it's an excuse for a judge to kick any case out anytime he wants and to violate a person's right to petition the government for redress of grievances, the right to go to court and say, "You're harming me. Please stop harming me." No, you don't have standing. They won't even hear the case. So I won't get into all the details of that. And I'm not sure I answered your question. But yeah, I'm kind of into law now.
Yeah. And, John, I've been watching loads of your videos, and I really would suggest, we're going to ask you where all these are going to be in a minute, but I just want to show our viewers and listeners a very short video that you've put out for youngsters. And this is what I want to talk to you about, the division between our generation and youngsters, and what do youngsters have to look out for. And this little video is called Civil Disobedience. Let's have a look.
Hi kids, here's the short version. The poison needle is a 10x greater risk of harm than COVID itself, including heart damage. The mask only works to make you compliant to government orders like a slave. Civil disobedience is not unlawful, so what is it? Civil relates to private rights and remedies sought by action or lawsuit, like the action of Vietnam War protests, or the lawsuit by a governor preserving the rights of his people. Remedy is the legal means, under natural law, not man-made law, to recover a right or prevent a wrong. You have a legal right to refuse unjust laws. Disobedience is refusal to follow commands. Together, civil disobedience means the legal means to recover a right or prevent a wrong by refusing to follow commands. Your intent must be to recover a right or prevent a wrong, and your act of refusing commands must be by legal means. Defiance of law without intent to remedy is not civil disobedience. Each cause and act must be civil. You need both pieces of the puzzle. Know what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what your objective is. The dictionary now says civil disobedience involves forcing concessions from the government. This is exactly backwards. Government is the one doing the forcing, and government is the one demanding we concede rights and freedoms like bodily autonomy. It is backwards on purpose to shape culture around words. Remember two things. Make sure you're attempting to recover a right or prevent a wrong to yourself or others, and do not comply. Government rarely rescinds a law on their own. It takes heroes of civil disobedience to stand up to them to get the laws changed. God bless you.
John, we know youngsters like messages short, and that was short, and it was extremely informative. I worry about the youngsters, as I don't think they see what we see. What's your message to them? And what's your message to our viewers and listeners that have got younger children and grandchildren that they want to pass the message on to?
Well, it's time to step up and realize that, we used to deem people adults at 13 years old, going way back in human history. You have to protect yourselves. The government means to kill you. And if you just are going to comply, you'll find one day that you won't be able to have children because for some reason you're sterile. How did that happen? What did they inject you with? You'll find that some of your friends are chronically sick. Some of them have cancers and died at a far greater rate than any time in human history. They mean to kill you. And the the ideas behind, and that was one of 5 videos for civil disobedience. I think it was the second or third one. It's a series. I get into the psychology of civil disobedience and how you can prepare yourself for an engagement, know what's going to happen if you're going to be arrested, understanding your rights. And it's not complicated. It doesn't have to be complicated. You can carry on a business card your rights, and you don't have to memorize them. You can just read them to the officer. And if you're not given a chance to read them to the officer, then you can have just a couple of things to say. And if you're going to be arrested, you're going to be arrested. It's better than dying. It's better than being forced into compliance with something injected past your skin into your body, which is a medical battery. We talk about informed consent, but the ideas behind that short 2-minute video, there's a lot in there. Lex injusta non est lex. St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas. These are ideas that formed from Aristotelian philosophy and Christian doctrine married together. It's not religion. It's natural rights as a human being. If you believe in liberty or not. If you don't believe in individual liberty, then you believe in slavery. You believe people can be enslaved, and you're just chattel to be sold and bought and used by corporations, oligarchists, oligarchs, and all the philosophy around that and how we come to aggregate as human beings in villages and towns, and we gather together for safety. That's mostly, and some people like the companionship, but it's really for safety and for utility. It's easier for everybody with an expertise to more efficiently do what they do as an expert, whether it's shoeing a horse or growing, taking care of farm animals. You become an expert at what you do, and therefore your little society can benefit from it, and everybody has to work less because you have the more efficient people at each job doing that job. All these philosophies and these economic studies of efficiency culminate down into little short messages that young people can understand like that. And one of them is the psychology of civil disobedience, preparing yourself to engage with the police, to engage with your school principal or your schoolmaster. The introduction gets into, they want you to eat bugs instead of meat. They're trying to destroy the meat production in the United States right now. Oh, H5N1. H5N1, I think there was a question asked early in this segment we did where, or maybe it was before we started recording, what will people fall for it again? No, people won't fall for H5N1 like they did with COVID. But how many people will it take to actually make a difference? I don't think it's going to be enough. And I don't think H5N1 is even about getting people to take the vaccine for H5N1 at all. It's going after the food supply. It's leaving an excuse. Oh, a couple of chickens died. Oh, now we have to kill 1 million chickens. 1 million. Because a few tested positive for H5N1 and one of them actually died. These are the excuses they're using to wreck the food supply. And then distribution. They're going to have to make sure the cities get enough food, otherwise the cities will riot. These are things that are being done on purpose by government. And the kids need to understand when they see signs. When you see a news story about, oh, this cow had H5N1, so we had to kill 500,000 cows. It's like, whoa, wait a minute. They're messing with our food supply? If I'm a young person, I'm like, something's really wrong here. Imagine if they don't understand it. If you don't have food, then people riot and kill each other.
You're talking food, and many of our audience now will be saying, yeah, and Debbie's talking about water, because I bet that's for maybe another interview. I can see so many rolling up because we've got so many questions to ask you, and I know that we are caught short a little bit on time. And before I bring Cheryl back to maybe give a last question or her final thoughts before we go to you for your last word, I'm going to ask you a question with regards to harms and the law. So hopefully it'll span both of your specialist subjects. But Do you think it would be helpful, because I do personally, and even law, or to be made law, that if a doctor or a medical professional or a nurse receives a report of a suspected harm associated with a vaccine or medicine, that report should be made public so that we can all see how many reports, and it should be a legal requirement for medical professionals to make that report public, and then we could see how many reports are being submitted. Because I'm just wondering how we ever get to the bottom of all of this unless we have some form of transparency from medical professionals who, at the end of the day, are there to prevent harm, right? So I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, we already have those laws. One aspect, it's a legal duty to act. Okay, you and I don't have, well, I don't know about your training, but I don't have a legal duty to act to save somebody from a certain thing that's not in my purview. You know, I'm an engineer. I'm not a doctor. I wasn't trained as a doctor. Lifeguards have a legal duty to act if somebody is drowning. Close family members have a legal duty to act to save their children. Let's say, I use this example all the time. They actually teach it in law school. If a boy is drowning, 6, 7 years old, and he says, "Toss me the life preserver," and you look down at your feet and you got the life preserver there, you just have to throw it 10 feet to save the kid. Nah, I don't feel like it. I'd rather just watch you drown and see what it looks like to watch a boy drown. You don't have a legal duty to act unless, if you're a close family member, then it's murder, because you do have that legal duty to act. If you're a lifeguard, if you've had lifeguard training even 30 years ago, you have a legal duty to act. If you're a paramedic, if you're a policeman, if you're a fireman. The reason this is important is because doctors and nurses have certain legal duties, as do politicians. And when they have notice and knowledge, if they've been given knowledge through some type of notice that the people are in imminent danger of harm, and it's in the purview of what they do, right? It's their job. They took the job to save people. They are basically preventing other people from getting that job because they took that job. Not only are they not doing the job, they're hiding information that would otherwise save them. This is murder. I mean, these are common law things that have been around for hundreds of years that just need enforcement. So it's not about making a new law. It's about enforcing the laws that exist, and for society to recognize the immorality of the inaction by the NHS, by any individual doctor who knows and is afraid to come forward because of the coercion from the government. If they come forward, they'll lose their job. So the government is committing murder against the people by not only not doing their duty to investigate the potential deaths, because they have that legal duty to act. They took that job in the government, in the NHS, in the FDA and CDC and NIH and the public health departments of every state. And the information is sitting right there, and they're refusing to look at it. 1 man week will end this for the entire world. No more debate. They have all the information on their servers, but they're not looking at it on purpose. So with regard to law, it's there. We have enough laws. Making new laws just kind of, I'm not a big fan of new law because the existing laws are not being upheld and enforced. And that's what it takes to change everything. But the people who would otherwise do the enforcement are not inclined to enforce because who's taking them to task? It really comes down to the people. Public opinion needs to swell big enough that these people fear righteous retribution. And when they fear righteous response to them killing the people, then maybe they'll do their jobs. Until then, we're kind of stuck.
But we have people like you to hear and listen to who has the irrefutable evidence. John, where can we find you? There will be links in the little article that'll appear beneath this interview. But where are the best places for people to find your latest information? And also tell us just a little bit about your book. And I know Cheryl will show us the book in a minute.
So I can be found, I do write a Substack which is articles. I haven't written a lot lately, but there's going to be more coming. And that's this right here, Coquin de Chien. So if you do COQUINDECHIEN.substack, SUBSTACK.com, you'll find articles. And if people want to catch up, you can go back more than 2 years to my first article and start reading, and you will probably learn a lot of information you've never heard before. And yet I've had it out there over 2 years. A lot of factual information. The first thing I do is I context the situation around morality. So the first one is, how can people do this to each other? Everybody talks about Matthias Desmet and the 5 things required for mass formation. I'm not a PhD. I just think the way a normal person would discern information he has. So fear of impending war, poor crop growth, prolonged cold temperatures, charismatic leaders. These are things that, and I do, that's in my video, actually, one of my civil disobedience videos. Those are things that can show somebody how this can happen, how society can be so crazy. And then the next one is about morality. I establish a moral foundation of a death lottery. You can't compel somebody to enter a death lottery, but that's what mandates do. They know some people are going to die, whether it's 1 in a million or 1 in 2. It's immoral. And Summa Logica LLC, that's SUMMA LOGICA LLC.com is where I'm moving most of my activity for posting my lawsuits and presentations that I do. Graphs, a lot of graphs will be posted at Summa Logica LLC. Right now, there are just a few press releases talking about the formation of Summa Logica LLC. The older one I'm moving away from is Via Vera Vita, VIAVERAVITA.com. That still has the lawsuits and graphs, old graphs and stuff. And what am I missing? Twitter at John Beaudoin Sr, JOHNBEAUDOINSR. I'm also on Facebook, John Paul Beaudoin Sr. Yeah, I think John Paul Beaudoin Sr. And where can you find my book? Can't forget that one. TheRealCDC.com. TheRealCDC.com. I'm moving away from the Coquin de Chien. That's the initials here. See, the D is lowercase, and my book says the real CDC with the D lowercase. That's what it means. It means bad dog or naughty dog in French. I'm kind of moving away from that because people can't pronounce it, can't spell it. So I'll just call myself the real CDC, like my shirt, right? Where is it? Right here. I'm kind of going with the real CDC. So therealcdc.com to buy my books. I'll have press announcements there as well. I think that covers everything.
Yeah. Here's the book. Okay. So it is possible to get hold of the book from the UK, and there's the evidence. Hopefully you'll buy that and through. It's a very interesting read. Thank you very much, John, for everything you've told us today. Obviously, it seems to me that everything that's happening in the States is happening here too. It's happening all over the world. It's a global problem. The evidence that we're collecting is enormous in terms of everything that's gone wrong with the treatments that have been used since 2021, and prior to that, during the COVID, the rollout of the infection in 2020. I'm still trying to get hold of information, particularly on pregnancy, and that is something that is being hidden at the moment, which I think is unforgivable. But public interest is growing, and hopefully we'll continue with your work and everybody else's work around the world to expose more and more. And all I can say is keep up the good work and come and talk to us again. It's been very interesting having this chat this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you very much for your time. It is good having this chat this morning. Thanks. I appreciate the time and the forum and the platform to address people in the UK as well as the United States. It's not often that I get to address people outside the US.
Well, I, for one, am very grateful to you, because it's really important that the United Kingdom hears what you found out, because it applies to us as well. I don't know what other to say than thank you. And I know that we'll meet again very soon. If that sounds a bit cliche, I apologise. But we always give our guests the last word. And this for you is your last word. With our love, grateful thanks, and God bless. Thank you. Over to you.
Humans have been on the planet 10,000 years, maybe longer. I don't know. But it's really not that long in the history of the planet and the universe and everything, right? 10,000 years. So for 10,000 years, humans thrived to where we were, say, 50 years ago. And we did that through our own discernment of what is good for us, what is bad for us. Somebody eats something and they die, we're not going to eat that. They drink from a pond, we're not going to drink from that pond. They got sick, they're throwing up. These obvious things that we discerned for 10,000 years that got us as a species to where we are, it seems to have been thrown out the window in the last 50 years or so. And what I say that because people have abdicated their ability to discern the facts and evidence around them. They've abdicated that to somebody in a white coat. If somebody who paints fingernails for a living puts on a white coat, people will listen to her as if she's an authority on something because she has a white coat on. It's really kind of, it's difficult to explain, but it seems that many humans have abdicated their ability to discern to authority figures. And I'm not knocking doctors and biologists. People come to them and ask them questions. They want answers. They want them to tell me what to do. Tell me what this disease is. Tell me about the vaccine. They've abdicated their thinking. They have the boy down the street died. Her niece died. Somebody's uncle died. Like all of a sudden they were perfectly healthy. Well, it happens. Oh, it happens. No, it doesn't happen this much. People need to use their own brains, use their own eyes, see what's happening. I mean, everybody knows some kid who got either myocarditis or had some pulmonary embolism or a deep vein thrombosis in their leg. Everybody knows somebody who's been affected by this vaccine. That's not a vaccine. This gene drug therapy. And if they can't see that, they're almost beyond help. But remind them, think about how it was 10 years ago. Did you see this? And if they can't use their own discernment like we did for 10,000 years as a human species, move on and find somebody else who will listen. We need to bring public opinion around. So, I mean, the closing comment is basically humans got to where we are over 10,000 years, and we're all messed up in the last couple of decades where we abdicate our own discernment to somebody in a white coat in the practice of allopathic medicine. It's crazy. And it's not the doctors or scientists' fault for basically putting us through 4.5 years without answers. It's the people. The people need to look at the evidence in the real CDC and the CDC memorandum, my 2 publications. That's enough evidence to destroy the whole COVID narrative. And it's irrefutable. It's not p-values, confidence intervals, and research papers with randomized controlled trial with 16% greater ABC than XYZ. And so there's a propensity for this to kill you by myocarditis or something else. No, my evidence is this guy died of pulmonary embolism that he got 2 days after he got vaccinated. Oh, and here's 5 more. There's 5 more people that reacted within hours, died within days from a stroke. And it's all the same thing. It's irrefutable. You don't need a doctor. The evidence is right there in front of you. So that's the message. It's rely on your own discernment. Try to convince people through factual-based evidence, and that's conclusive evidence, not persuasive evidence that would otherwise come from a doctor or a biologist. I appreciate all they do. It is absolutely necessary to have them, it's persuasive evidence that will be on top of the conclusive evidence. The conclusive evidence is right in front of you. Pay attention. That's it. Thank you very much for having me.